couple of comments before I go back to the company history. And by the way, I think Louis is probably the earliest employee of EBH that's sitting in this room. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I can remember when you came out there. I can remember when Fred and Sally came to our house.
Yeah.
Before Fred came to
When you
work.
were a
We
baby.
interviewed them, both of them. They're wonderful people. And I'm sure sorry Fred's not here. I want to make a comment about the ladies who worked at EBH, because we have had a crew that just flat wouldn't quit. Literally. Grace came to work, I think, before anyone else was here. Sharon might have earlier.
I worked part-time for Earl, and then I did little things.
Yeah. You were just out of high school.
Yeah.
And some of the others of you, Bonnie, I'm not sure how old you were, but you weren't very old. You were not a kid. But from the day one, we've had ladies that worked for this company that I wouldn't trade for at all. Okay, I'm going to go back to 1950. Something happened that changed the whole course of my life and was responsible for this company being formed. We were working in Dallas. I was a construction superintendent and with a contractor there, and we were building buildings and houses and everything. And the Korean War came along, and that changed everything. Lydia and I, well, the first thing happened, the government required that everything that was worth having to build a building with was saved for the government. There was no building material available to private enterprise, and I lost my job because of that, like people have since, a lot of time for other reasons. But I had been out of the Navy for a couple, 3 or 4 years, and so Lydia had a sister living in Great Bend, and I had a sister living in Great Bend, and we decided to come up here and visit with them. We had 2 children then. So we came up and had a nice visit. And then that was in early 1951. In the course of that, between the 2 sisters, we met a lot of folks. And one of the big things about Great Bend was that the city had been taken over by young people. The average age, I'd say, of the people that were in the city offices and the city commission and the city council at that time were in the middle 30s or lower 40s. That appealed to us. The size of the town appealed to us. We were living in Dallas at the time, and we knew that we didn't want to raise our family there. So we came up to visit them, met people. Some of these names won't mean much to any of you, some of them will. We met Larry Krause and Galen Howell and Joe Murmas and a whole bunch of people in that general generation. At that time, there was one architect here in Great Bend. His name was Dick Hansen, and Henry worked for him. So these people that we met in these social gatherings talked to us and talked us into coming up here. Larry Krause said, if you'll design me a building for my podiatry practice, I'll let you build it. So Galen Howell said, if you'll move up here, I'll give you an office space, no rent, no nothing, just space. So that was at 1313 Williams. If you drive by there today, it's been burned out. But that was our first office. So we decided we'd do it, and I went down. Went back to Dallas. I drew up a plan for 1105 Williams, and sent it to Larry, and he liked it with the price that I had no idea I could build it for. But I was using Dallas prices at the time, so we decided to make the change. So Lydia at the time was, as she was fairly often, it seems like in those days, pregnant. And Warren was waiting to come along, and her doctor said, you can't travel yet. So I came on up anyway, and I stayed with her sister. Vera's husband worked for Phillips Petroleum. He was a tool pusher, and he was up in Wyoming at the time, so I didn't take his bed, but I got a bed. They had 2 kids, and so it was a great place to stay. My first job after I got to Great Bend was carrying sandbags on the Arkansas River. There was a big flood that year, and this was in April of '51. And I went down to Roland Kufeld, had a cabinet shop down on Washington, and I went in there and I drew up a plan for a drafting table, and it was cool. It had a shelf in it and a cutout hole in the front, and it was just a great drafting table. And I don't know if it survived now or not, but I'd love to get it back. I don't know what I'd do with it. Anyway, I set that up in Galen's office, in the front of his office, where his wife was secretary, and then that was the engineering service company, and it was born in April 1951, and that was a forerunner of EBH. So I had started out making a big deal with Galen and his 2 partners. One of them was Sept and the other one was Elmer Waddell, and they had a developers thing going over there, where in Holland Street and that area, those small houses there, and they were building. Archie Lindholm was building it for them, but they hadn't let a contract on the clothesline pole. So fortunately, when I came up from Dallas, I brought a wheelbarrow and a shovel, and actually I still have the shovel at home, but it was for doing concrete. But I got a deal to put in all the clothesline poles and wires for that subdivision, and that was my first engineering job. I actually, before we came up, I went to a store in Dallas and I bought a little transit that was probably right after George Washington got through with it. He probably sold it for a second-hand store, and I bought that and a little builder's level, and I was in the surveying business. I also bought a level rod that I moved up here with, just in case I had to end up doing some actual engineering or surveying. And so I lined up the pole. These houses were side by side, and so I'd line up the poles with my transit and get out there and mark the location of the holes. And I'd go get my shovel and I'd dig a hole, and then I'd go get a sack of ready-crete, and I'd put the clothesline poles in there and brace them up and pour the concrete. So I was a builder also, and then I'd string the wire and all that. Soon after that, Lydia and the kids came up, and by then I was probably knocking down $20, $30 a month or something like that. So we came up here on a very limited budget too, by the way.
You didn't have a budget.
I didn't have anything. So let's see. Lydia had met Hazel Smith, who was Herb Smith's wife, and Hazel was the newcomer lady at that time, and they got to be friends, and Hazel found out that I was an engineer, and she said, well, her husband was an engineer, and he worked for Western Light and Telephone, so she wanted us to get acquainted. So I went up and saw Herb. I was seeing everybody I could to get to know my name out, and incidentally, meanwhile, the people who had talked me into coming up here, Don Foss had me do a remodeling job on his house, George Schumacher on his house, Dale Engelman and Joe Shermley building houses for themselves. So I was getting some work, but it was mostly architectural work, and then I'd do the building that went along with it usually. So where was I?
Well, when did Henry come in with you?
Huh?
When did Henry Rondo come
Well,
with you?
Henry was working for Dick Hansen at that time, who was a local architect and was the only one here. And Henry was not happy with his arrangement. And after I got to know Dick, well, I could figure it out. So he came in and he said, I'll go to work for you for beans. And I said, I don't have any beans. He said, well, I can live on whatever you can get. So I began to get enough architectural work, remodeling work and everything that I was trying to do the building stuff. So I brought him in, and that would have still been in '51, and several months after we got here. And so things went along pretty good with what we were doing. And Gale had come in a couple times. He had worked for the county as an assistant to Phil Bigham, who was the assistant county engineer at that time.
You need to tell them about the result of Herb Smith.
I will. Thank you. Thank you.
That's because...
Yeah, I will do that, but I appreciate the reminder. I told you this off the top of my head, so it gets away from me. Anyway, I met Herb Smith, and he said, well, Western Light and Telephone is getting ready to build a transmission line from Heiser to Smith Center and from Heiser to Medicine Lodge. And I thought, well, that sounds good. They said, we'd like to know what you would charge to do the fly line. As all of you, I'm sure, know, the fly line is just producing point to point on the ground that they have drawn on an aerial map. So I said, sure, I can do that. And I went home and figured, and as I recall, it was $50 a mile. And when I gave them that price, they thought, well, even if he blows it, we haven't lost it. so they gave me the job, and I hired an old boy that was living out of his car, and I don't recall his name, but he was not the best roommate I ever had. we ended up, when we got to Smith Center, if you remember the old Smith Center Hotel, it's probably gone now, but it had rooms in it that had a bed that two people could sleep in, and he and I shared a bed, and that was not my best engineering experience, but it was cheap. So we did that fly line, and I kind of probably started some new things because we did it at night, and if you think of the hills up there around Osborne and in that area, I got on one of those hills and I shot in 17 miles of that line at night with flashlights, and this guy figured out how to read my blinks, and I could locate him in, and I knocked out that stuff for not very much, and that was probably 80 or 90 miles, I don't know how far. And it tickled the heck out of Slim Rathman, who was in charge of that for Western Light and Telephone. So he said, okay, we'll do a contract to go ahead and go down to Medicine Lodge. So by then, this guy had either gone off to somewhere else or something, but by then, I hired the first guy that I hired. Some of you might have known he had paralysis when he was a boy. He had a brace on his leg. Wilbur Nuss. Wilbur Nuss, his brothers were the ones that ran the barber shops here. And Wilbur was a hard-working kid, and he and I did most of the one going south. But during the time that we were doing that, Gale had come in a couple of times, and he wanted to come to work for me. He didn't enjoy his current job, so we were doing enough work then that I did need help. And I knew I was going to need a lot more because I had a pretty good idea that we'd also get to do the plan and profile and so on for the line. So I gave them a price for that, and they were satisfied with the work we'd done, so they made a deal. And so Western Light and Telephone actually put EBH in business back when it was Engineering Service Company. And shortly after that, we changed the name to Evans Rondo and Associates. Gale and Sue and Henry and I all became partners at that time, which was probably 1952 or 3, I don't know which, but then Henry started getting a lot more architectural work, and so I quit the construction work and we were doing nothing but surveying then, and Gale was going out. About then's when Fred came in, and Fred and Gale started going out and rounding up wastewater plants and water systems and real engineering work from these western Kansas communities. So, and Henry was getting the Security State Bank and the library and I don't know what all else around here. So we went out and got Chuck Smith. He was then an architect with Charlie in Salina, and Jack Williams was an architect with an engineering firm there that did heating and air conditioning, and so they both came down here. And so Western Light and Telephone, I give credit for putting us in the business, particularly in making money and the surveying. Meanwhile, I'm getting acquainted with Will Townsley, who some of you remember, and Will was state senator from Barton County at that time, and he was on the Turnpike Authority, which had just been formed to plan a turnpike for Kansas, from Kansas City to Wichita. And so one day we were in the Mayflower Cafe, and Will said, "Bob, aren't you interested in getting some of this turnpike work?" And I said, "Sure I am," having no idea what it was involved in getting this turnpike work. Anyway, he said, "Well, if you'll come up to Topeka," and gave me a date and a time, and I'll introduce you to Joe Sorkin, who is the chief engineer and partner in Hired Needles, Tammany and Bergendorf, which is a big company, which I didn't realize at that time how big they were, but it's an international company. So I went up and talked to Joe Sorkin, and he said, "Well, you don't have enough experience to qualify to do this job. If you get another firm that's has a little more experience in road work and could add some more people to your outfit, well, maybe this would work." Well, it turns out that Chuck had a friend in Colby, George McKee, who had a firm up there, who did all highway work, secondary road work. So George and I combined, and we got the job. And as a result of that job, Howard Needles was very well impressed with our firm. So they hired us then to start doing the interstate, all of their design surveys for interstate work. Later, Black and Veatch started hiring us to do this and that. Then I went down to Tulsa a time or two to the Corps of Engineers. They hired us to do boundary surveys on lakes around in Kansas. We did all the roadways around Wilson Dam. So we were off and running. And we were getting enough work that we were hurting for additional, for a legitimate engineer, a structural engineer. And we liked to think we could do bridges. And I think we may have tried one or two, but we didn't have a real bona fide bridge engineer. So we went looking and found Stu. By then it was 1967, I believe, and Stu was working for a bridge consultant in Topeka, and he came in with us. And then later on we included him in the partnership, so it was, well, I skipped an awful lot here, which is all right, except that I do want to point out that Evans and Bierly split with Rondo, Williams, and Smith, while we still lived out on the out on 10th Street at the K96 in that old wooden building that we had bought down in Zenith, Kansas, from the Stanley Oil Company. They had shut down, and I can't remember why I went down there, but they said they were like to sell the building. So we bought the building, moved it up to the location out there at K96, and that's where we were working when we split. The architects took that building as part of their deal. We didn't trade any money. We split up what we owned, including the building, and all we had were things like transits and levels and things like that. So by the time they ended up getting the building, and that gave them an edge. But they leased to us then until we had a fire in 1959. That fire, by the way, when I mentioned to all the ladies that work for us, I'm going to back up once, because the first lady that ever came to work with us, his name was Tommy Chancellor. I don't know if any of you ever knew Tommy, probably not. But Tommy was a excellent, I hate to say it, but she was a hard-ass American girl. She played third base for the for the Great Bend softball ladies team, and she was good. But she was, and things keep coming up, and I'm running out of time here. So
you have all the time you need.
Well, thank you, Lou. Back when we were still at 1313 Williams, my brother-in-law Jim McWilliams and Charlie Steinkamp quit their jobs with the geologists. They were both petroleum geologists. They formed their own firm, and the problem is they didn't have any well logs, and to have a petroleum geology business, you got to have files of well logs and Kansas wells. So they said, if you'll buy a photocopy machine, we'll give you enough business to pay for it. So we bought the first photocopy machine in Barton County, and started. At night they'd bring these file cabinets of cards over, and Tommy would do the work copying them, and so she was not only secretary, she was a photocopier, and she was a wonderful asset to the company when the company was 3 people. Anyway, that's an aside, and now I forget where I was. Anyway, I had, by that time, we were making enough, having enough jobs, and we were making enough money. We had up to, I think, something over 50 employees at that time, off and on, because the summer work we'd be hiring surveyors that would only work during the summer. And there have been a few stories told, but in 1971, Charlie and Joe Strobel graduated from KU, and they both wanted to stay in Lawrence, so we opened an office there with them running it. After about 5 or 6 years, that arrangement did not work out too well, and Joe Strobel quit. So Stu and Gail and I, meanwhile, I've skipped, when Stu came to us, and it didn't take long before we knew that he would make an excellent partner. So he bought into the firm then, and so when Joe left Lawrence, we decided someone should go up there to help Charlie, and he needed help. Anyhow, we each had an option to go, and it ended up that I went. I was just a few years from retirement, so Lydia and I went to Lawrence, and Stu and Gail took over here. Gail became president after I retired, and then Stu. And whatever's happened to this company since then, I don't know. I have not been part of it, but this sort of thing just tickles the heck out of me. And I appreciate the opportunity to blow off some steam. That's all I got. Any questions? Thank you.